Stefan.
Actually, let me make a couple points. One is I wanted to come back to the comment gentleman made in the audience, Africa for Africa. I couldn't agree more. Let me just say that from two lenses. One is, of course, the best source of nutrition for any young infant is the mother. Now, the level of knowledge, the level of what nutrition means is very basic. We did some primary research, and it basically shows the concept of nutrition is to have enough energy to get through the day. That the importance of breastfeeding, the importance of good nutrition, that education needs to happen, and that can only happen on the local level. All the projects we are involved in, it's about setting up local systems, local education. I fully agree with the social system, because that's where the education comes from. It doesn't come from a divine source. It needs to be in the local community. But then you also need to be able to act on that knowledge, and then you need the infrastructure in some cases. So fully agree, Africa for Africa, and in fact it's local level, local value chains. Now to answer the question on the Minister of Finance, let me put it the other way around. Of course I fully agree with the economic argument. In fact the Copenhagen consensus of economists has answered that question. It is in fact, as you heard, but it is a long-term return. That means that Minister of Finance you talked to today will not be in office when the return comes. And that's the problem. So the first thing you need to say to the minister is don't worry about re-election. Do the right thing for the long term. Now, as we all know, this is a very difficult sell, no matter what the economic argument is. So at the end of the day, I couldn't agree more with what Tom said earlier, a member of the audience. It's invest in nutrition education, and therefore by default also invest in women's empowerment, because that's where the action is. That's how nutrition happens. I say that as
Stefan, I want to ask you an additional question, which is that in DSM, I imagine that you have a risk register, and that the board looks at the risk register very regularly. I mean, when I was director of a little research institute, my board were always saying to me, you should manage the institute by the risk register. And I just wonder what role the risk register plays in DSM.
That's a UK accounting term. Risk register?
You don't have a risk register?
We have risk management process, yes.
Okay, well give us a few sentences on how you use that and what it tells you.
Well, we really look at that on different time horizons. Track about 20 different trends, and actually you can look that up in our annual report. But sustainable protein production, because good nutrition is not just carbohydrate, but protein is one of the biggest things that we're looking at, how to ensure that can happen in the long term, given rising incomes, rising populations.
But does your board worry about things like exchange rates or financial shocks?
Of course, but that's all in the name of the game. I think what I said earlier, in the end, if you have a healthy system, and by comparison, the publicly traded company is a healthy system, otherwise it wouldn't survive. So we have that covered, I think.
All right, thanks so much. Carolyn, you raised this very important issue about the private sector also at the beginning.
I thought I have -3 minutes, but anyway.
No, you have, no, because they gave us an extra 10. You have 2 minutes.
I just want to say resilience is really about healthy societies in the end, whether it starts with healthy people and so on. And I think any society needs 4 types of capital in order to flourish. You need human capital, you need institutional capital, including government and industry. You need social capital, Dan just talked about it, and you need political capital. So, but those 4 types of capital, I think everything begins with human capital. So I would tell the finance minister, invest in human capital, whether that is health or education.
Okay, thank you very much. Listen, I think this has been a really useful discussion because it's been practical. And very often when we plan and when we live, we think about the trends and not the shocks. And yet, whenever we are in the world, we see that shocks can have an enormous destabilizing impact. And some of those shocks are climatic, but many of them are in the world economy, are financial, or are institutional. There's an example I cite a lot, which is extremely interesting, which is that there's one town in Pakistan which was the major center for producing footballs. It's called Sialkot. 100,000 people worked stitching footballs in Sialkot. And one day, thousands of miles away in Geneva, FIFA decided to change the specification of the football to make it more round. And they changed the tolerance by a tiny amount. But suddenly, it was not possible for the hand stitchers of Sialkot to produce footballs which met the new specification. And in the space of 3 years, employment in Sialkot fell in the football sector from 100,000 to under 10,000 people. And production shifted to machine-made footballs actually in, I think, Bangkok. You know, we assume that the world will continue, and it doesn't. Look at BlackBerry, look at Nokia. In India, the indigo industry, which was huge in about 1900, virtually disappeared in the space of 3 years. Or the disruptor because of chemical dyes being produced in Europe. Or the container, which completely revolutionized the whole organization of shipping, transport, and ports around the world. Or the financial crisis, which actually completely disrupted the economies of the world and still has long-lasting legacies today. So we have to think about shocks and how we manage them. And I think the key lesson that we've had from this session is, first of all, that we have to build on the resilient side of making people less sensitive to shocks. So that when the shock hits, you have more alternatives. You have more diversification, you have more capacity because you're better fed, and so on. But you also have to deal with the falling trees and the shocks. And as you do that, there are really important choices to make. And I think the idea of the risk register, actually, which is kind of the point that Tom was making, is a really valuable idea, which is to have a good mapping of the risks and to see what are the cost-effective interventions. My little idea about this is that in Europe and in the United States, they talk about stress tests for banks. And they say to banks, you have to look at what the most likely stresses are facing your enterprise. For example, a fall in house prices of 30% drives the financial system to destruction. So why don't we do a stress test on food systems? You know, we are in this room food policy specialists. We look at the local and the community and the social capital right the way up to the international system. We need a stress test. And what they do with the banks when they see that there is a problem is to say, well, you have to have bigger reserves. And I suspect that for us also, we need to think not about reserves, but we need to think about the measures we can take to build resilience through the system and then be very demanding. And it should almost be regulation. Just it's the central banks who are running these stress tests in Europe and in the United States. Maybe we need an international, maybe IFPRI-led stress test of global food systems, country by country, region by region, and for the world as a whole. That will enable us to identify where the stresses are, as somebody said in the discussion, and what needs to be done about it. I think we've had a really valuable discussion with some very experienced people giving us really practical solutions, but also excellent participation and ideas from the audience. So I want to call for a round of applause for you, for your contributions, but especially for the panel. Thank you all very much.